On the morning of November 19th, 1999, Carolyn Stahl had an extra bright smile on her face as she saw her patients at her eye clinic in Long Beach, California. Sure, it was another busy and hectic Friday, but it was also Carolyn's 44th birthday, and her husband Ken was going to take her out to dinner the next night to celebrate. In many ways, Carolyn and Ken Stahl were a classic Orange County power couple. She was an optometrist, and he was an anesthesiologist at a nearby hospital. They lived in a condo in a gated community, and Carolyn's interior design talents had made their home the envy of all their friends. And with no children at home, Carolyn and Ken liked to spend their money on things like expensive clothes, travel, and extravagant hobbies, like Ken's antique sword collection. But even with all that wealth, Carolyn had always remained down to earth. She was sweet to her friends, and she remembered their birthdays and other special occasions with cards and gifts. She talked to her mother back in her native Michigan at least twice a week, and she was planning a trip back home for the holidays to see her. And Carolyn took special care of Ken and always made sure he had whatever he needed. Carolyn even picked out the seeds from Ken's watermelon because she knew he couldn't stand them. Carolyn remained in a great mood that day as she gave eye exams to one patient after another. And it was the first time in a while she'd felt like everything was going well in her life, because she and her 57-year-old husband, Ken, had been through a lot that year. Ken had been having heart problems, and a few months earlier, he had undergone an 8-hour operation to restore proper blood flow. The surgery had left Ken feeling weak and depleted for months in a way Carolyn had never seen before. Carolyn knew that bad hearts ran in Ken's family. His father had died from a heart attack, so she really didn't take her time with her husband for granted. And recently, Ken had finally started feeling much better, and he told Carolyn how excited he was to go out with her for her birthday, and so Carolyn was so excited. Ken planned to take them to a Mexican restaurant in the pretty town of San Juan Capistrano, and then after dinner, they'd go on a romantic stroll near the historic Spanish mission in the area, and Carolyn thought this was a perfect way to celebrate her birthday, and to celebrate a new start for the couple. The following day, Saturday, November 20th, Ken was busy getting ready for his and Carolyn's big night out, and he really wanted everything to go perfectly. If Carolyn was sweet and sociable, Ken was intense and ambitious. He always felt like he was following in his father's footsteps and not quite measuring up. Ken was the only son of a prominent anesthesiologist who had once owned a hospital and made the news all the time. By comparison, Ken had only managed to get himself appointed to an obscure medical board, and he never seemed to fly quite as high as his father. Ken was really close to his mother, but he suspected that even she thought his career was less impressive than his father's had been. Ken also had this growing sense that he was running out of time. He worked out like a maniac to stay fit, and routinely went on 25-mile hikes and day-long bike rides. He was naturally athletic and had gone to college on a football scholarship, but Ken knew he had very likely inherited his father's heart problems, and so he was unlikely to live to a ripe old age. But this really only served to make Ken more driven to succeed in the time that he had. But on that particular Saturday, as Ken got ready, he actually found himself feeling quite relaxed. And when Carolyn walked into the room he was in, wearing a pretty red dress and seemingly all the gold and diamonds she owned, Ken just stared and smiled. Ken finished getting ready, then took his wife's hand, and they walked outside together. They got into Ken's car, pulled out of their gated community, and set off on the 25-mile drive to San Juan Capistrano for their big birthday dinner date. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser, out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of San Juan Capistrano. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door, but he went around to the driver's side and he saw right away the front window was smashed, and Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. After getting Castillo's message, the sheriff's office assigned 2 veteran detectives, Joe Holmes and James McDonald, to lead the potential murder investigation. They arrived on the lonely stretch of road on Ortega Highway at about 1 a.m. The area was already alive, with crime scene technicians and sheriff's deputies gathering up evidence, photographing the victims, and just trying to make sense of the baffling scene. The deputies who were already at the scene informed Detectives Holmes and McDonald that the victims were indeed Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And based on the scene in the car, the deputies believed that Ken had been shot first and then Carolyn. Detective Holmes looked closely at the 2 bodies inside the car, and he thought the deputies were probably right. He thanked them for their help and then did an initial search of the car and the surrounding area. And honestly, Holmes was kind of impressed by how little physical evidence had been left behind at the scene. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no skid marks, no bullet casings, and no weapon. Whoever did this had been very thorough, leaving law enforcement with almost nothing to work with. But then Holmes and McDonald did an extensive examination of the bloody interior of the car, and they began to discover some clues. Carolyn was covered in expensive jewelry, and the only piece that was missing was a single earring that had fallen on the ground. Likewise, Ken had plenty of cash and credit cards in his wallet, but nothing of value had been taken, so this didn't look like a robbery. The 2 detectives saw that both victims had been shot multiple times from outside the car. 1 bullet had gone through the driver's side door, and the others through the open window. So this could not be a traditional murder-suicide either. Somebody else had fired 8 to 12 bullets into Carolyn and Ken and then left them for dead. To Holmes and McDonald, this honestly looked like a mob hit, and the shootings had a depressing familiarity to McDonald. In his years as a detective, he had investigated multiple murders on this highway, Ortega Highway. There was the farmhand who was found buried in a shallow grave, and the dead man in the trunk of an abandoned car. McDonald sometimes thought that Ortega Highway was pretty much just a place for killers to dispose of bodies. But he just couldn't begin to understand how 2 middle-aged, very successful doctors from a wealthy gated community could wind up slaughtered in this desolate place. Word that Carolyn and Ken had been gunned down on a rural mountain road near San Juan Capistrano immediately dominated the news. The seemingly random quality of the shooting sent a shiver across the whole region of Southern California where Carolyn and Ken lived, and it left Ken and Carolyn's family and friends almost speechless. No one could imagine somebody hating the couple so much that they needed to kill them. The owner of the eye care clinic where Carolyn practiced joked that Carolyn was so kind they deliberately gave her the grumpiest patients because she could always cheer them up. And Ken's colleagues spoke equally highly of him. A doctor who had served on a state board with Ken said that he was revered by other doctors for his wise medical judgment. And friends also pointed out that the couple worked all the time, often 6 days a week. Ken provided anesthesia for surgeries at multiple medical facilities, so he had a complex, unpredictable schedule. And Carolyn was so devoted to her practice that she had previously canceled vacation plans to avoid inconveniencing her colleagues. So their friends wondered when they would even have time to have made enemies. And early on, investigators struggled with the same question. On December 4th, so 2 weeks after the murders, hundreds of mourners crowded into St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach, California. They cried together, they comforted each other, and they celebrated Carolyn and Ken's lives. Ken's 87-year-old mother made her way to the front of the crowd. She said she had always braced herself for the possibility that her son might die young because of his bad heart, but nothing had prepared her for her son's violent end. Then she broke down in tears and said all she wanted to do was hold her son one more time. In the days following the funeral, Detectives McDonald and Holmes still didn't have much encouraging news for Ken and Carolyn's families, but their investigative team was still very busy. At a separate memorial service held for Ken by his colleagues, deputies had asked all the attendees to sign in a guest book. They wanted to know who was there, and they wanted to compare handwriting samples to documents they had collected from where Ken and Carolyn lived and worked to see if they could find anything connecting Ken's colleagues to the killings. But after a few weeks into the investigation, Holmes and McDonald still didn't have a suspect in mind, but they were getting a better picture of the killer. The autopsy confirmed that both Carolyn and Ken had been killed by multiple gunshots sometime between the hours of 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., so not long before Deputy Castillo had found the car. Also, a separate ballistics analysis found that all the gunshots came from a single gun, most likely a .357 Magnum revolver. That gave Holmes and McDonald a couple of key pieces of information. First, Ken and Carolyn were most likely murdered by a single gunman. And second, the killer was cold and collected. They had fired at least 8 shots from a revolver that held only 6 bullets, meaning the shooter had to stop in the middle of the murders, reload their weapon, and start firing again. Those reports forced Holmes and McDonald to think about the last minutes of Carolyn's life. Her husband was dead, and she was all alone in a cold, dark, strange place. Meanwhile, her killer was casually reloading their gun so they could shoot more bullets into her. I mean, this was a truly awful way to go. And that information pushed the detectives to dig even deeper into Carolyn and Ken's lives in the hope they would find something that would lead them to the killer. And in doing this deep dive, Holmes and McDonald soon discovered that Carolyn and Ken's 14-year marriage was not nearly as perfect as some of their grieving friends and relatives had thought. Some of the couple's loved ones had come forward and told the detectives that Carolyn and Ken had problems, a lot of problems. Carolyn's sister Linda actually reached out and asked to meet with the detectives. She said she didn't want to speak ill of the dead, but she really needed them to know the truth. And so, on a cool December day, Linda arrived at the sheriff's station, and she followed Holmes and McDonald into a small, comfortable office. And within a few seconds of sitting down, Linda went on an absolute tirade about her brother-in-law, Ken. She told the detectives that Ken had a history of cheating that began way before he even met Carolyn. Ken's first marriage had ended because Ken had an affair. Then Ken had married the woman he had the affair with, but that marriage also fell apart within just 3 months. Linda said her sister Carolyn was well aware of Ken's romantic history when she had moved in with him back in 1984. But Carolyn was determined to make a better man of him. And after they had been living together for a year, Carolyn gave Ken an ultimatum: marry her, or the relationship would be over. Ken had told friends he never wanted to get married again, but he reluctantly gave in to Carolyn's demand. Linda said their marriage actually seemed to go pretty smoothly for a while. Carolyn was close with Ken's mother, and she was also close with Ken's son from his first marriage, and with 2 doctors' incomes, they made a ton of money, and so their future looked quite bright. Suddenly, Linda trailed off and just stopped talking. The detectives asked her if she needed a break, or if they could get her anything, but she said she did want to keep going. She needed to get this all out. Then Linda took a deep breath and composed herself, and told the detectives that things had taken a really bad turn for her sister about 5 years earlier. She said Carolyn had come home from visiting family in Michigan, and she found a woman she didn't know eating fast food on the couch in her living room. The woman was just as surprised as Carolyn, and she fled the house immediately, but Ken had admitted he was romantically involved with that woman. Linda said she had hoped her sister would just leave Ken right then and there, but she didn't. Instead of demanding a divorce, Carolyn had demanded marriage counseling. But even with marriage counseling, Ken's behavior didn't change. He had at least 3 more affairs that Linda said she was aware of, and she said his address book was still full of women's names and phone numbers. Linda clutched the arms of her chair tight, and she fought back tears while she talked about her sister. But she took a deep breath and continued her story. She told the detectives that she had been so angry at Ken that she finally confronted him about his chronic cheating and about how much he was hurting her sister. One of the detectives asked how Ken responded to that, and Linda gave a slight laugh and shook her head, and then she said Ken had just shrugged his shoulders and told her that, he was the person he was, and Carolyn just had to accept that. Finally, Linda told the detectives that Carolyn went to great lengths to hide the ugly truth about her marriage. Carolyn was always very careful to give the impression of marital bliss to friends and coworkers. She would even buy herself her own Christmas presents. She would wrap them and put tags on them that said they were from Ken, even though obviously they were not, and she would put them under the tree, and so that when friends and family came over, they would see how good Ken was being to his wife. And Ken just played along with this for the sake of appearances. Linda said one of the reasons Carolyn was buying all these gifts for herself is because she believed buying nice things for herself made her happy. She called it retail therapy. But Linda knew her sister better than anybody, and she knew no matter what Carolyn did, no matter what she bought, no matter how nice it was, nothing could change the fact that Ken had totally broken her heart. The detectives shared a look. Linda's retail therapy comment had just potentially cleared up a question they'd had for weeks. When they had searched Carolyn and Ken's home right after the murders, they found nearly $30,000 in brand new women's clothing and accessories. A lot of it was actually still wrapped in plastic, with the price tags still attached. That had really confused the detectives at the time, but now it kind of made sense. The detectives thanked Linda for all her help, and then they walked her out of the station. McDonald and Holmes hadn't let on in front of her, but Linda's revelations about Ken and Carolyn's troubled relationship opened up a world of potential murder suspects. Did a former girlfriend take revenge on Ken for leaving her? Or did a jealous husband of one of the women that Ken had an affair with lash out? There was even a chance that Ken had been the lone target of one of those jilted lovers or angry husbands, and Carolyn had just happened to be with him at the time of the murder. With this new information, the detectives now wanted to dig into all of Ken's communications with all the women he was potentially having affairs with. Like most doctors in the 1990s, Ken carried a pager, which is a small electronic device that buzzes and gives a phone number to call when somebody needs you. The detectives got Ken's pager, and they contacted every phone number on it. This at least allowed them to reconstruct key parts of Ken's last day. The detectives found a fellow anesthesiologist who paged Ken around 8 p.m. on the night of the murder. This other anesthesiologist had hoped that Ken could cover for him at a surgery the next morning. The doctor said Ken sounded normal when they talked, and that Ken was out celebrating his wife's birthday. So McDonald and Holmes reasoned that whatever happened to the couple that night probably caught them completely by surprise. McDonald also came across a Mexican immigrant named Adriana Vasco who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders. She explained that she had become friends with Ken several years earlier when she worked in the office at the National Pain Institute where he was a part-time anesthesiologist. Adriana said that Ken had agreed to get her desktop computer repaired, and she had paged him to find out how the repairs were going. McDonald was immediately suspicious of this. He couldn't understand why a busy doctor would be volunteering to repair computers on the side. The detective asked Adriana flat out if she was having an affair with Ken, but she denied it. Adriana insisted that Ken was just a very generous guy. He had helped her out financially numerous times over the years. The call with Adriana lasted only 5 minutes, but McDonald came away from it with the distinct sense that he had just been lied to. But he had no evidence to back up his gut feeling, so he let it drop, at least for the moment. Over the coming days, McDonald and Holmes repeatedly asked Ken's family and friends what they knew about Adriana Vasco. The detectives got nothing but blank stares. None of the friends or family had ever heard of her. Then, in late December, a woman contacted the detectives and admitted right at the start that she'd had an affair with Ken in the mid-1990s. And when she heard about the murders, she'd recalled a conversation she'd had with Ken back then. She said Ken had complained that he was being blackmailed by someone close to him and that he was not in control of his own life. The woman's story was chilling, and blackmail was not out of the realm of possibility. After all, Ken had had multiple affairs, and most people assumed he was rich because he was a doctor. But the detectives had also discovered that Ken's health issues had caused him to miss months of work in the past. that had led to some financial strain and had forced Ken and Carolyn to move out of their $700,000 home into the comfortable but much more modest condo where they had lived at the time of their deaths. The detectives also knew Carolyn had spent at least $30,000 on clothes and jewelry for herself. So now Holmes and McDonald wondered if the murders simply came down to money. Maybe Ken couldn't pay someone who was blackmailing him, so they killed him and his wife. But as 1999 came to an end, the detectives still had no major suspects. They had followed a bunch of different leads, but so far, nothing had paid off. However, both detectives had a strong feeling that cracking this case would begin with one of the women Ken had an affair with, and they thought that woman could be Adriana Vasco. Both detectives were confident she knew a lot more than she had told them, so it was time to have another conversation. On February 29, 2000, so over 3 months after the murders, detectives McDonald and Holmes met Adriana Vasco at her friend's house in Anaheim, California. Adriana was little, she was barely 5 feet tall, and she was quite thin. She was 33 years old and a single mother of 2 young kids. Over coffee at her kitchen table, Adriana told the detectives how she had become friends with Ken, a man who seemed to live in a completely different world than she did. She explained that Ken had noticed her walking with a limp when they were both working at the National Pain Institute. Ken had offered to inject pain medication into her back to correct the limp, but he told her it would be an ongoing procedure. At the kitchen table, Adriana took a sip of her coffee, and then a smile came across her face. She said she had agreed to the procedure, and as the pain injections continued, the two of them started getting a bit closer. Adriana said she had even begun calling him Ken instead of Dr. Stahl, and Ken had clearly taken a growing interest in Adriana's life. Then, when Adriana had split with her husband, Ken paid for her and her son to go live in a motel. When Adriana's car had broken down, Ken gave her money to buy a new one, a white Mazda. So Adriana told the detectives it became normal for her to turn to Ken for help because he was always so kind to her. And Adriana said that in return, she became a shoulder for Ken to cry on. He opened up to her about his unhappiness. He told her he hated the Orange County doctor's life. He thought it was totally phony. He said he had a lot more fun when he went to the beer and barbecue chicken restaurant, which was down the street from Adriana's apartment. Ken had even told Adriana at one point that she was his only real friend. Detectives McDonald and Holmes sat on the edge of their seats, wanting to ask Adriana again if she was actually romantically involved with Ken, but they held their tongues and just let her talk. Adriana continued and said that Ken's marriage had been empty for years. He complained about his wife's looks and her weight, and he said they mostly slept in separate bedrooms. Then Adriana began to cry. She apologized and said she was still in shock over Ken's death. She said when she found out he died, it was like her whole world had just collapsed. Ken was like her hero. Finally, after Adriana wiped the tears from her face, she looked across the table at the detectives and she admitted that she had had an affair with Ken. And Ken's wife, Carolyn, knew about it. She told the detectives that about 3.5 years earlier, she had received a phone call from Ken, but the moment she answered, Ken quickly handed the phone off to his wife, Carolyn, and Carolyn's message to Adriana was blunt: "Stay away from my husband." Adriana said she broke off the affair soon after getting that phone call. She knew Ken would never divorce his wife, and she didn't want to get hurt. But she and Ken had remained friends even when Adriana found a new romantic partner and even had a daughter with him. In fact, Adriana said that Ken would sometimes go out to dinner with Adriana's new guy. Also, Adriana said after they split up, Ken never tried to have sex with her again. And she told the detectives that she really believed that Ken and Carolyn had genuinely started to work on their marriage at the time they got killed. And when she had spoken to Ken on the day he was killed, Adriana said he sounded happier than he had in months. McDonald and Holmes had more questions for Adriana, but the coffees were long since cold and it was after 5 p.m., so they thanked her for her time and they headed for the door. By the summer of 2000, the sensational double murder that had once gotten so much media attention was increasingly in danger of going cold. McDonald and Holmes had come away from their interview with Adriana convinced that her grief over Ken's death was actually sincere. She was probably lying about the length of their affair, but the detectives couldn't see why Adriana would want Ken dead. He had been a ready source of money and support to her for years. So the hope that one of Ken's lovers would lead them to the truth about the murders began to fade, and the detectives hadn't found any evidence that Ken had been blackmailed by anybody. Holmes and McDonald continued to pursue every possible lead, and they re-interviewed anyone who seemed to be remotely connected to the case, but their investigation stalled. In the fall of 2000, about 10 months after the murders, McDonald and Holmes were reassigned to another unit, and two new detectives, Brian Heaney and Phil Villalobos, took over Carolyn and Ken's murder case. Initially, the two new detectives felt totally overwhelmed. Villalobos had only been a homicide detective for 2 weeks, and Heaney's experience was mostly just in narcotics. But as they began to dig through the huge case file, they realized that their predecessors, McDonald and Holmes, were likely overwhelmed too. But something caught Detective Villalobos' eye as he reviewed Ken's cell phone records from the day of his death. Ken had called the same number 4 times, and the calls were to the same person who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders, Adriana Vasco. So Villalobos and Heaney quickly decided to pick up where the previous detectives had left off, and they turned their focus to Adriana. And at 8 p.m. on October 11th, almost 11 months after the murders, Adriana arrived at the sheriff's station for another interview. But this time, she was not eager to help. Adriana insisted that on the day of Ken's murder, she had only contacted him to talk about those computer repairs, and that the conversation was so innocuous that she couldn't even remember anything else they talked about. The two detectives pressed Adriana hard to get her to say more. Villalobos even asked her straight out who killed Ken. But Adriana broke into tears and said she had no idea and genuinely could not remember anything substantive from their last conversation. The detectives would question Adriana really aggressively for several hours until finally it was clear she just didn't have anything else to say, so they let her go. But the detectives were not quite finished with Adriana. After she left, the detectives rushed outside after her and hopped in their car and followed her. After driving for several minutes, Adriana arrived at a house where the father of one of her children was waiting for her. Adriana and this man had split up, but they remained close for the sake of their daughter. The detectives watched Adriana with this man from a distance, and they began to develop a new theory. Maybe Adriana did have nothing to do with Ken's death, but maybe this man who she was with, the father of her daughter, had gotten jealous of her affair with Ken, and maybe he lashed out. And so now maybe Adriana was doing everything she could to protect him, really just so her young daughter would not be without her father. Villalobos and Heaney waited for Adriana to leave, and then after she had, they hopped out of their car, walked up to the front door, knocked, and then when the man came to the door, they led him to the front yard to question him. And to the detective's surprise, this man was completely open and asked how he could help. Villalobos told him that he was convinced someone close to Adriana had killed Ken and Carolyn Stahl, but the detectives didn't know who. The man said that made sense to him, and he understood why they would want to question him, but then this man said something that sent Villalobos and Heaney reeling. He told them that he had nothing to do with Carolyn and Ken's murders, but he had a pretty good idea of who probably killed them. Villalobos just stared at him and then asked him outright, okay, who's the killer? And the man would say one word, Tony. The detectives were caught off guard. In all those files from nearly a year-long investigation, the name Tony had never once come up. Now they had someone telling them a guy named Tony was probably the killer they had been looking for. The detectives followed up with a bunch more questions about who this Tony person was, and they would learn that Tony was Adriana's current boyfriend, and he was a handyman at her apartment building. He also had a long criminal rap sheet, he had a temper, and he loved guns. A few days later, Detective Heaney was waiting in an unmarked car outside the hospital where Adriana worked. Investigators had been trying to track down Adriana's boyfriend, Tony, but the man seemed to have disappeared. So Heaney wanted Adriana to help them find him. Eventually, Adriana walked outside, still dressed in her scrubs, and right away Heaney rushed up to her and caught her completely by surprise. He asked her point blank if she would take a polygraph test right now. He said the test was all set up at the local police station right around the corner. All she had to do was come with him. Adriana was clearly shocked and pretty angry with Heaney for surprising her like this, but she did go with him to the police station. During the polygraph test, Adriana faced round after round of very difficult questions from Heaney and Villalobos, and Adriana held her ground, denying any knowledge of the murders. But then, Heaney hit her with a surprise question. He asked if Tony was the killer. She tried to deny knowing Tony, but it was already too late. The detectives knew he was her boyfriend and that she was lying to them. So Heaney began asking rapid-fire questions about Tony. Where was he? Did he know Ken? But Adriana collected herself, and she insisted she had no answers for them. But the detectives were convinced Adriana was now the key to unlocking this case, and too many people had been working for too long on this investigation to let this opportunity slip away. And it turned out the detectives had one more surprise for Adriana. There was an outstanding warrant for her arrest for driving with a suspended license, and they were going to use that to lock her up for the night. Adriana begged to be allowed to go home to her kids, but the detectives handcuffed her and led her to a cell. Now they just had to find Tony. Even after being locked up, Adriana did not tell the detectives where her boyfriend Tony was. But her phone bill showed that she had repeatedly called a number in Greenville, North Carolina over the past couple of days, and Detective Villalobos had a hunch that those were calls to Tony. Villalobos sent a picture of Tony to local police in Greenville, and right away an officer in Greenville contacted him and said he recognized Tony. He told Villalobos that Tony actually went by the name Dennis Godley in Greenville, but the local cops just called him the Weasel because he was so good at eluding arrest. However, the officer in Greenville said he would still be able to lead Villalobos and his partner right to Tony. So Detectives Villalobos and Heaney headed right to the airport and took a flight from California to North Carolina. And while they were there, they did meet and interview Tony. However, he was totally uncooperative. He claimed that he had never been close to Adriana and that he had absolutely no role in the death of Ken and Carolyn Stahl. The detectives flew home feeling frustrated and with almost no new information, but their plan with Adriana had worked. After spending the night in jail and worrying she would not get to go home to her kids, she was now finally ready to tell the detectives everything she knew about Tony and everything she knew about Ken and Carolyn's murders. And by the time Adriana was finished talking, Detectives Villalobos and Heaney were ready to make arrests in a case that had now gone on for almost a year. Based on Adriana's jail cell interview and evidence collected by both teams of detectives throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Carolyn and Ken Stahl out on Ortega Highway on November 20th, 1999. On that November day, the killer sat in the passenger seat of a parked car not far from the restaurant in San Juan Capistrano, where Ken and Carolyn were celebrating Carolyn's birthday. The killer calmly loaded their .357 Magnum and made small talk with the driver. But the driver wasn't listening. They had their eyes focused on the road right outside of the restaurant. Then the driver suddenly told the killer to be quiet. Ken's Dodge Stratus had just pulled out onto the road. The driver waited to let Ken's car get a little further away. Then the driver started their car, pulled out onto the road, and followed Ken. The driver tracked Ken onto Ortega Highway. The highway was dark and oddly quiet. The driver gripped the steering wheel tight and closed in on Ken. Meanwhile, the killer just kept talking like nothing out of the ordinary was even happening. Then at some point, Ken's car pulled off the highway into the breakdown lane near an emergency phone box. The driver told the killer it was time to act. Then the driver hit the gas, raced by Ken's car, and then did a U-turn into the breakdown lane. The driver's headlights were now shining directly into Ken's windshield. The driver put the car in park, and then the killer casually stepped out of the car. The killer walked right up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass, and Ken rolled the window down. Ken was about to say something when the killer casually raised the .357 Magnum and fired. The bullet hit Ken behind the left ear and exited through his right eye. Carolyn began to scream from the passenger seat and tried to undo her seatbelt, but she was in shock and her hands were shaking, and so she couldn't get free. The killer then fired another shot into Ken, and this time the bullet shredded his aorta, the body's main artery, and so blood sprayed all over the car, and Ken slumped over, dead. Carolyn finally got her seatbelt off, but by this point, the killer stuck his gun through the open driver's side window and fired multiple shots point blank at Carolyn, hitting Carolyn in the chest. Carolyn screamed again and blood began to pour down her shirt, but she was still alive. So the killer aimed the gun at her and fired again, but they were out of bullets. So as Carolyn is sitting there slowly dying and screaming and looking at her dead husband, the killer walked back to the other car. They opened up the passenger side door, shouted something at the driver, and then grabbed extra ammunition from a bag on the floor. Then the killer calmly reloaded their gun and then turned back and began walking towards Ken's car again. By this point, the killer saw the passenger side door of the Dodge Stratus was now open. Carolyn tumbled out of the car and one of her earrings fell to the ground. She was covered in blood and struggling to breathe, but she managed to brace herself against the back door of the car and stay on her feet. Carolyn looked around for any kind of escape route, but then she heard something behind her. She turned and saw the killer walking towards her with their gun raised. There was nowhere to go. In a last, desperate attempt to save herself, Carolyn dove back inside the car head first. One of her red shoes fell off as she struggled to pull herself across the front seat of the car over the body of her dead husband. She was trying to get to the driver's side so that maybe she could speed away and save herself. But the killer just walked to the open passenger door, aimed their gun at the back of Carolyn's head, and fired off 2 more shots. Carolyn fell over dead in Ken's lap. The killer leaned in to make sure both Ken and Carolyn were dead. Then they did a thorough sweep of the car and the road around it to make sure they picked up any stray evidence, like bullet casings. Finally, when the killer was satisfied, they walked back to the white Mazda that was still parked with its lights shining directly into Ken's car. Then the killer got back into the Mazda and looked over at the driver. And the driver was shaking and horrified. The killer told the driver to calm down and just get out of here. But the driver shouted at the killer that they were not supposed to kill Ken. The driver said she loved Ken, and Ken was actually the one who had paid them to murder his wife. It would turn out Adriana was the driver, and her boyfriend, Tony, had indeed pulled the trigger and killed Carolyn and Ken. But Ken had actually been the one who set the entire thing in motion. It turned out Ken had wanted his wife dead for a long time. He wanted to be free to have relationships with lots of women without any repercussions and just to live his life however he wanted. But Ken felt like he was reliant on Carolyn. She took care of him and she made a lot of money, so if his health issues kept him from working again, he would still be able to live well because of Carolyn. Ken went so far as to tell some people that Carolyn had control of his life, and it was like he was being blackmailed just to stay in the marriage, even though that was just not true. But finally, Ken told Adriana that he had just had enough, and he asked her to help him murder his wife. Adriana said her boyfriend Tony would be perfect for the job. He was good with guns and calm in any situation. So Ken paid Adriana and Tony $30,000 to carry out a hit on Carolyn. And Ken and Adriana hammered out all of the details, including the exact location on Ortega Highway where Ken would pull over and the murder would go down. On the day of the murder, Ken had contacted Adriana multiple times to let her know when he and Carolyn were heading to the restaurant, and then when they arrived, and then also when they were leaving. And Adriana and Tony had been waiting nearby to follow him to the spot they'd agreed on. But when it came time to actually do the job, Tony took things into his own hands. He didn't trust Ken, and he didn't want the middle-aged doctor around to pin the whole thing on him. So Tony decided to just kill Ken too. Carolyn was truly just an innocent victim. Her husband had plotted against her and had even tried to paint her as some kind of blackmailing monster. But Carolyn's friends and family knew that despite all of Ken's cheating, Carolyn still loved him, and she still believed they could repair their marriage. But Ken had no intention of doing that. At trial, Adriana insisted that she tried to talk Ken out of going through with the shooting, and that she ultimately only went along with it because she was afraid of Tony. But ultimately, a jury would convict her of masterminding the entire murder plot and sentenced her to life in prison without parole. As for Tony, he would ultimately plead guilty to the murders in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. And Tony would insist to the very end that Adriana was the one who shot Carolyn, not him. As 31-year-old Nikki Vanderhayden leaned in close to the bathroom mirror and swiped mascara onto her lashes, she could hear her infant son laughing from the other room. She leaned back and peeked out of the doorway into her bedroom, where her boyfriend, 34-year-old Doug Dietrich, was playing peekaboo with their 7-month-old baby. Nikki smiled and then plugged in her curling iron. It had been a long time since she'd gotten dressed up for a big night out. But it was finally Friday, May 20th, 2016, and Nikki and Doug had tickets to see a rock band play at a bar in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Even though the couple had a baby together, this was actually kind of like their first big night out together. Nikki had met Doug less than a year and a half before. At the time, Nikki had just been divorced, and she had 2 young children from her previous marriage. She wasn't looking for a serious relationship, but Doug was tall and handsome, he worked at his family's very successful home building company, and he even owned his own house. And so they had gone on a few casual first dates, and just 1 month after they met, Nikki was pregnant. The baby was a total surprise, but Doug had been excited to become a father. He'd invited Nikki and her 2 children to move into his house, and he took care of all 3 of them during Nikki's pregnancy. And now they felt like a very cohesive and loving family of 5. But as much as Nikki loved her kids, she did really need a break sometimes. For the last 7 months, she felt like her life had really been consumed by caring for her children, working as a substitute teacher, and going to the gym to get back into shape. She and Doug barely got to spend any quality time together, and so she hoped this fun night out to this concert would help them connect. As Nikki wrapped a section of her long blonde hair around the curling iron, she heard the doorbell ring. Doug called to her from the bedroom and said he would go get it. A few moments later, Nikki's friend, Dallas Kennedy, rounded the corner into the bathroom. Dallas was tall and thin with long blonde hair and a lip ring. She'd offered to babysit that night so Nikki and Doug could go to this concert. Dallas asked Nikki where her 2 other children were, and Nikki said that their dad, her ex-husband, had taken them for the weekend, so Dallas would only have to look after the baby. Dallas said that made her job much easier, so that was great. Then Dallas left the bathroom so Doug could show her where to find the diapers and baby bottles and anything else she might need. Nikki finished doing her hair and then walked to her closet. As she did, Doug shouted from the other room that their friend and designated driver for the night, Greg, would be there to pick them up in just a minute. So Nikki quickly chose an outfit, got dressed, grabbed her purse, and rushed out towards the front door. Dallas was standing near the door with the baby, and as Nikki passed them by, she thanked Dallas again for babysitting, she gave her baby boy a kiss on the top of his head, and then she and Doug headed outside. 2 hours later, at 10 p.m., Nikki sat at a table in a neon-lit sports bar called The Watering Hole, watching a man play a drum solo on stage. The room was loud and quite packed, but Nikki had still managed to find a table that was big enough to fit her, Doug, Greg, and a few more of Doug's friends that they had met up with. Everybody was enjoying just chatting loudly over the music, but for Nikki, after spending 7 months basically stuck at home with the newborn baby, all she really wanted to do now was just get up and go dance. Nikki jumped up and skipped over to Doug, who was in the middle of a conversation with Greg, and asked him to dance with her. At first, Doug seemed reluctant, but he got up, took Nikki's hands, and led her out to the dance floor. The music was fast, with lots of percussion and electric guitar, and so Nikki and Doug jumped around until they were both out of breath. Then, Nikki just stopped and stood still and looked up at Doug with a huge smile on her face. Their relationship had really been such a whirlwind that they'd never really been able to let loose like this before. I mean, they barely even dated before Nikki was pregnant. Doug smiled back at Nikki and said he'd get them both another drink, and so he walked towards the bar. Nikki stood there for a moment in the middle of the room looking around, and she noticed a couple of guys checking her out. And for Nikki, who had not felt super attractive since she'd had her 3rd baby, this attention kind of felt good. But in reality, Nikki was not remotely interested in these random men. It was just the idea that they liked her that she liked. When she turned and saw Doug coming back towards her with a beer in each hand, she felt so lucky to have found such a handsome, caring, awesome guy. After another hour of drinking and dancing, the lights in the bar got brighter and the band left the stage, and Nikki felt disappointed that her big night out was already over. But then one of Doug's friends, named Angela Delfos, came up to her and asked if she wanted to go to a dive bar right down the street called the Sardine Can that had this big fake shark head hung on the wall behind the bar. Nikki laughed and said she definitely wanted to keep the party going. So she went over to Doug, who was sitting at the table across from Greg, and asked if he wanted to go to this sardine can bar. But Doug said he and Greg needed to finish talking about something, so Nikki should go ahead and they would just catch up with her in a few minutes. Nikki smiled and said okay, and then she headed out with Angela and the rest of the group. Once at the sardine can, Nikki got another drink and mingled with Doug's friends. But as time passed and Doug and Greg did not show up, she started getting kind of mad. This was supposed to be her and Doug's night out together, so why wasn't he here? Why was he prioritizing Greg? After waiting now for at least half an hour for Doug, who still had not shown up, Nikki sat down on a bar stool and somewhat angrily called Doug, but Doug didn't pick up. She texted him, and he didn't reply. Frustrated, she ended up finishing her drink and ordering another one. Angela sensed something was wrong with Nikki, so she came over and asked if she was okay. Nikki tried to temper her emotions, but she'd had a lot to drink and felt like her boyfriend had kind of abandoned her. She told Angela that Doug wasn't answering his phone, and she said it in a way that conveyed her frustration, and so Angela just said, okay, I'll try calling him myself. And when Angela called, Doug answered. And this made Nikki so mad. It was obvious what was going on. Doug was clearly purposefully ignoring Nikki. He wouldn't answer her phone calls, but he'd picked up Angela's right away. And for Nikki, the worst part was she just wasn't that surprised. She'd always felt like Doug had a wandering eye. They'd even had arguments about it before. And Nikki had told Doug that when she caught him clearly staring at other women, it made her question their relationship. And so Nikki just could not ignore the little voice in her head that said Doug was only with her because she'd gotten pregnant and they had a baby together. And so while Angela was still on the phone with Doug, Nikki sent Doug a very angry text message. Then she slammed the rest of her drink, stood up, and stormed out of the bar. She felt someone grab her arm and she spun around to see one of Doug's friends. He asked her what was going on and told her she should come back inside, but Nikki by this point was so drunk and so emotional and angry that she just started punching the guy's chest and telling him to leave her alone. The guy looked surprised, but he backed off and returned to the bar. Now alone on the sidewalk, Nikki considered going back to the watering hole where the concert had been and confronting Doug, but then she ultimately decided against it, and instead, she went in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, Nikki walked into a bar called Richard Cranium's. The place was dark and loud with multiple TVs playing different sports games. Nikki texted Doug again as she went up to the bar, took a seat, and ordered another drink. She kept her eyes on her phone for several minutes after sending this text, only looking up to thank the bartender when he brought her drink. Finally, when she did not get a response from Doug, she took a deep breath and just put her phone back in her purse. Nikki looked around, and just like at the first bar, she noticed there were a few random guys sort of checking her out. For a second, Nikki thought about going up and flirting with someone just to kind of spite Doug. But then, she saw the front door of this bar open, and she made eye contact with the person who walked inside. At the same time, across town at Nikki and Doug's house, the babysitter, Dallas Kennedy, was starting to nod off on the couch when she heard the front door unlock. It was almost 3 a.m., and she actually had not expected her friends to stay out this late, but she was going along with it. Doug stumbled into the house alone and obviously was very drunk, and Dallas immediately asked him, where's Nikki? And Doug just shrugged and mumbled that he didn't know. Dallas couldn't believe that Doug didn't make sure his girlfriend got home safe. So Dallas tried calling Nikki, but the call went straight to voicemail. Even though she felt really angry at Doug, she knew arguing with a drunk guy at 3 a.m. was not going to get her anywhere, so she gathered up her stuff and she left. When Dallas climbed into her car to drive home, she couldn't help but feel like something was just not right here. But she told herself that, she has no idea what really happened here. Maybe Doug and Nikki got in a fight or something, and, maybe Nikki's phone had died and she wound up crashing at a friend's house, who knows? But Dallas was certain that by tomorrow, whenever Nikki got up, she would certainly be in touch. The next morning, a farmer who lived about 2 miles away from where Doug and Nikki's house was, went out to his shed to check on some alfalfa seeds. He put them in water to soak a few hours ago, and now he wanted to see if they were ready to plant. But as he made his way towards the shed, the farmer saw his grandson and his grandson's friend sprinting towards him, and both boys looked absolutely terrified. They stopped in front of the shed, breathing heavily, and the farmer's grandson told him there was a dead body in the field. The farmer was so taken aback, he actually thought the boys might be messing with him. But he trudged out to the field anyway, and from a distance, he saw what he thought was maybe a deer's auburn coat. However, as he got closer, he realized it was obviously not a deer. It was a woman whose blonde hair looked red because it was now caked with blood. The farmer stopped in his tracks. He told the boys to go back home, and then he used his cell phone to call the sheriff's department. The county sheriff's office was less than a half-mile away from the farmer's land, so detectives Brian Slinger and Rick Lopnow got there in minutes. Slinger was a veteran detective with 18 years of experience, and Lopnow had handled his fair share of homicide cases. But as they both stood in the field over the body, they both felt a little shocked at the grisly scene. The victim was a woman who laid face down in the dirt, naked except for her socks. Her blonde hair was matted with blood, and the outline of a shoe was visible on her back, as if whoever had killed her had also stomped on her. And just the idea of that really made Detective Slinger's stomach churn. Slinger and Lopnow put on gloves, and they turned the woman's body over. Slinger saw bruises all over her body, and he noticed her fingernails were ragged and bloody as well. To him, this was a telltale sign that this woman had fought against her attacker. Then, Lopnow pointed to a dark purple mark circling the woman's neck. Both men agreed that it looked like she'd been strangled. Slinger could tell that this woman's final moments had been horrible, full of pain and horror, and even though it was too late to save her life, he promised himself that he would find who did this and bring them to justice. That afternoon at 4:30 p.m., a dispatcher at the county sheriff's office got a call from Doug Dietrich, who explained that he'd gone bar hopping with his girlfriend Nikki the night before, and she still had not come home, and so he said he wanted to report her missing. The dispatcher by this point already knew that a deceased woman had been found in the area that morning, but that information was not public yet. If the woman in the field was Doug's girlfriend, the dispatcher knew that he would likely be a person of interest in the investigation. So the dispatcher had to be careful not to reveal any details to Doug. So the dispatcher simply told Doug that a sheriff's deputy would come by his house at some point today to take his statement in person. And sure enough, a few minutes later, the deputy arrived outside of Doug's home wearing a body camera. The deputy knocked on the door, and when Doug answered, it was very obvious to the deputy that Doug was hungover. He had dark circles under his eyes, and he sort of cringed at the sunlight. Doug led the deputy into his kitchen, where they both sat down. Doug then repeated his story about going bar hopping the night before with his girlfriend Nikki, and then he said at some point he'd lost track of Nikki, maybe just before midnight. And at that point, the deputy asked why, if Doug had not seen his girlfriend since, midnight the night before, why did he wait until now, 4:30 p.m. the next day, to report her missing? That seems so reckless. Doug sort of hung his head and told the deputy that Nikki had gotten really mad at him last night, and so he figured she just needed some space and would come home eventually. So he hadn't gotten worried until this afternoon when it seemed like, no one had heard from her and she still wasn't home. The deputy thought this sounded pretty suspicious, but he nodded and asked Doug for a physical description of his girlfriend. Doug said Nikki had blonde hair and blue eyes, she was about average height, and she worked out a lot, so she had a very athletic build. The deputy told Doug they would start looking for Nikki immediately. Then the deputy went outside, got into his car, and called the dispatcher to let them know what Doug had said. The dispatcher, after hearing this, then called Detective Slinger, who was still out looking for evidence in the farmer's field, and she described to him Nikki's physical appearance. And Detective Slinger sounded somber as he said that physical description matched the deceased woman in the field to a T. The next day, Sunday, Detective Slinger sat in the county medical examiner's office, drinking cold coffee and waiting for the autopsy results. He hoped the medical examiner would find some helpful clues, because so far, a search of the farmer's field had not turned up anything useful. Slinger got a phone call from a patrol deputy, and when Slinger answered, the deputy began speaking a mile a minute. He told Slinger he'd been driving a couple miles away from the field, and right before he was about to merge onto the highway, he noticed something in the grass on the side of the road. And so kind of on a hunch, he pulled his car over to go look around, and he found multiple articles of blood-stained clothing. It looked like someone had tossed the clothes out of their car window right before getting onto the freeway. Slinger's heart raced as he realized this could be their first big break. He told the deputy he'd be right there, then he called his partner, Detective Lopnow, and told him to join him at the scene. A few minutes later, Slinger met Lopnow and the deputy on the side of a busy highway on-ramp. As cars rushed by, the deputy led the detectives through the grass and showed them the bloody clothing, which to this point the deputy had not touched at all. And so while Lopnow began taking pictures and bagging the clothes as evidence, Slinger began to walk around the area to see if he could find anything else. And before long, he stumbled on a purse. The detective put on a pair of gloves, then opened the purse up and looked inside. He saw there was a cell phone inside with a dead battery and also a photo ID from the Green Bay Public School District for a pretty blonde woman named Nicole Vanderhayden. Slinger already had a strong feeling that the woman they found in the field was Doug's girlfriend, Nikki, but now he knew for sure. It had to be her. He brought the purse to his partner, and Lopnow went ahead and packed it into an evidence bag. Lopnow said he would bring everything to the sheriff's office to be cataloged and then sent off to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Meanwhile, Slinger praised the deputy for his sharp eyes and told him what a huge discovery he'd made. Then Slinger jumped into his car and headed back to the medical examiner's office. By the time he got there, the autopsy was complete, and the medical examiner sat down with Slinger to discuss what he found. He told Slinger Nikki had likely died during the early morning of Saturday, May 21st, so just a few hours after Doug claimed he had last seen her. Nikki had suffered 2 potentially fatal injuries, blunt force trauma and ligature strangulation. In other words, whoever killed Nikki had severely beaten her and then used some kind of rope to strangle her. Either one could have killed her. Nikki had also been sexually assaulted, and defensive wounds on her hands showed that she'd fought against her attacker fiercely. Detective Slinger shook his head sadly. On the one hand, it was good that the autopsy revealed so much information, but it was horrible to think about how terrifying Nikki's final moments must have been as she slowly lost the fight for her life. The medical examiner said he'd removed Nikki's socks, and he'd also taken swabs from underneath her fingernails, hoping that between the socks and the swabs, that some or all of those items would contain a DNA profile from Nikki's killer. And he told Slinger he would send all of that to the state crime lab for analysis. Slinger thanked the medical examiner and headed back to the sheriff's office, where he found Detective Lopnow sitting at his desk looking very frustrated. Slinger asked him if everything was okay, and Lopnow said he'd just spoken to a representative from the state crime lab, and they were so backed up that they would only be able to accept a few pieces of evidence at a time. And so not only would the detectives have to pick and choose which items should be examined first, but it could take weeks or even months to get results. Lopnow couldn't believe that these bureaucratic delays could potentially derail their entire investigation. Detective Slinger was disappointed too, but he decided to move forward with old-fashioned detective work while they waited for the crime lab analysis. And that meant talking to literally everybody who'd gone out with Nikki on Friday night. Most importantly, talking to her boyfriend, Doug. On Sunday afternoon, the detective sat in an interview room with Doug, listening to his story about what happened on Friday night. Doug said that he and Nikki had gone to a concert at the Watering Hole, and then Nikki and a few other friends had gone to a different bar called the Sardine Can at 11 p.m. Doug explained that he and his friend Greg had stayed behind to finish their conversation and didn't show up to the Sardine Can until about an hour later, so after midnight. But by the time Doug got to the Sardine Can, Nikki was already gone. His friends told him that she'd left, so he figured she'd gone to a friend's house or something like that. Doug said that he and his friend Greg had stayed at the Sardine Can until 2:15 a.m., and then Greg dropped him off at home. Doug went to bed at 3, woke up at 6:45 to feed his baby, and then slept again until 11 a.m. After that, he stayed home all day waiting for his girlfriend to come home, and then when she didn't, he finally reported her missing at 4:30 that afternoon. Hearing Doug's story, Detective Slinger could not understand why Doug was not more worried when his girlfriend suddenly disappeared during their night out, and that made Slinger very suspicious. After all, Doug's alibi was not exactly airtight. Based on the medical examiner's findings, it was possible that Nikki was murdered after 3 a.m. on Saturday when Doug claimed to be home asleep by himself minus his baby. On top of all that, the detective already knew that Doug was not being completely truthful. Slinger had watched the body cam footage from that deputy who took Doug's missing person statement, and in that video, Doug said that Nikki had gotten really mad at him on Friday night, something Doug was not talking about now in this interview room. So Slinger pressed him about that. Doug admitted that Nikki had gotten really mad at him on Friday night because he had missed a few of her texts and calls, and then he had picked up a call from one of Nikki's friends, and Nikki was aware of that, and so Nikki obviously thought that Doug was ignoring her, but Doug said he really wasn't. It was just a misunderstanding. Detective Slinger was curious about these calls and text messages from Nikki, and so he asked Doug if he'd be willing to let investigators look at his cell phone data, and Doug said sure, and handed over his phone. Slinger left Doug alone in the interview room while he went to his office to review the messages. Starting after 11 p.m. on that Friday night, Nikki sent a string of very angry text messages accusing Doug of lying and cheating on her. She called him an abuser and said, quote, "You hurt me all the time," end quote. Reading this, the detective realized there must be a lot more going on in Doug and Nikki's relationship than met the eye. Slinger scrolled through a few more of Doug's text messages, and he saw that Doug had been messaging his mother about wanting to sell his house and end his relationship with Nikki. Doug told his mom he just was not cut out to be a family man. Sitting there in his office staring at Doug's phone, the detective couldn't help but wonder, was Nikki just drunk and upset, or was there truth to her accusations about Doug abusing her? And if Doug felt trapped in this relationship, how far would he go to get out? But before Detective Slinger could do anything else, he had to go tell Doug that Nikki was actually deceased. And so he got up, he went back into the interview room, and he just sat down and told Doug flat out that they were no longer looking for Nikki because she had been found and she was deceased. And Doug immediately broke down, began hyperventilating and crying and sobbing. He was inconsolable. And Detective Slinger just sat there and let Doug cry for a while, and then at some point, Detective Slinger got up and he left the room, unsure if Doug was the best actor in the world or if this was a genuine reaction. Regardless, he knew what he had to do next. Slinger went back to his office and downloaded all the information off of Doug's phone for his records, and then he began drafting a request for a search warrant to search Doug and Nikki's home. Later that day, Detective Slinger and Lopnow and a small team from the sheriff's office met at the big gray house where Doug and Nikki lived, armed with this new search warrant. They went inside and poured over every inch of the place. At first, everything seemed very neat and tidy, but then Slinger found a crumpled sweatshirt on the counter in one of the bathrooms. He picked it up and he noticed a few dark red stains on the front. Then Lopnow pointed to the bathroom trash can where two wadded-up bloody tissues were clearly visible right on top. The detectives bagged the sweatshirt and tissues as evidence, and just as they were about to leave the bathroom, Slinger noticed more drops of blood on the floor, leading to the shower. The detectives wondered if this might be where Doug came to clean up after he killed his girlfriend, but they couldn't jump to any conclusions quite yet, so they kept looking around, and eventually they went out to Doug and Nikki's garage, where they found Nikki's car. Lopnow peered into the car windows and immediately told Slinger to come look in the back seat. Even through the tinted windows, Slinger could easily see at least two dark brown stains on the seats, which he thought could be dried blood. He tried to open the door to get a better look, but the car was locked. Slinger began to walk around the car to try each door to see if they were open, but as soon as he crossed behind the vehicle, he just stopped, because right there on the cement floor, he saw a big dried blood stain. Suddenly, Slinger felt like he could see the crime playing out in his mind. He imagined Doug, drunk, coming home from the bar, and Nikki, also drunk, getting there a few minutes later, and then Nikki and Doug must have had some kind of fight in the garage, and the detective figured that Dougie killed her right there, where the big bloodstain was. Then Doug would have put Nikki's body in the backseat of the car, which would explain the bloodstains there, before dumping her body in that field and then disposing of her clothes and purse on the side of the road. After that, Doug must have come home and cleaned up in the bathroom, where they found the bloody sweatshirt and tissues. But Slinger knew this theory left one key question unanswered. How did Nikki get home from the bar? She didn't have her car that night, and the area where she and Doug went bar hopping was more than 12 miles away. And if Doug was telling the truth about coming home without her, then somebody else must have driven her there. Just then, the detectives heard someone pounding on the front door. They went through the house, opened up the door, and saw an older man standing on the porch looking totally freaked out. He held two pieces of a broken phone charger up in the air. Slinger asked the man what was going on, and he said he'd been mowing his lawn, which was just next door, when his mower had hit something and malfunctioned. He turned off the mower and flipped it over, and wrapped around the blades was this phone charger. But as he worked the cord out of his lawnmower, he realized there was some sticky red liquid on it that came off onto his hands, and when he smelled the red liquid, it had that coppery scent of blood. The neighbor said he knew the police were investigating Nikki's disappearance, and he wondered if maybe this phone charger could be some kind of evidence. The detectives asked the man to show them exactly where he'd been when the cord stopped his lawnmower, and the neighbor led them to the line right between his yard and Doug and Nikki's yard. The detectives began looking around in that area, and in the green grass, they noticed there were a few chunks of blonde hair. Then Lopnow pointed out 3 medium-sized bloodstains on the curb. Clearly, Slinger thought, his earlier theory had been wrong. Nikki had not been murdered in the garage, she'd been killed right there in the street in the middle of the night, and Slinger felt sure the killer had used that phone charger to strangle her. The detectives thanked the neighbor, then they took the phone charger and also the hair in the yard as evidence, and they took pictures and swabs of the bloodstains in the car, garage, and on the curb. They would ship all of it to the state crime lab for analysis as soon as possible. But even before those results came back, Detective Slinger felt like they already had probable cause to arrest Doug and at least hold him in jail. So they got an arrest warrant, and officers brought Doug into custody on Monday, May 23rd, just 2 days after Nikki's murder. Handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser, Doug cried and wailed and hyperventilated and told officers that they really had all of this wrong. But Detective Slinger didn't think so. All he had to do now was wait for the crime lab analysis to prove it. Over the next few weeks, results from the backlogged state crime lab slowly trickled in. And then, in early June, Detective Slinger got a call from an analyst at the lab who said they had just made a huge discovery. They'd found a partial male DNA profile on Nikki's body, and the same partial profile had been found on that phone charger that they all assumed at this point was used to strangle Nikki. Slinger was ecstatic. He knew a partial profile could not actually be used to definitively link a suspect to a crime, but it was enough evidence to rule suspects out. He figured if this partial profile matched Doug's DNA, well, that was just one more reason to really feel certain that Doug was guilty. So the detective got a DNA sample from Doug, who was still being held in the county jail, and they sent it to be compared with this partial profile. And when Slinger got the results, he was shocked to see that Doug's DNA was actually not a match. To Detective Slinger, this didn't make any sense. There was blood all over Doug's house and yard, and yet the DNA analysis showed that a completely different man had grappled with Nikki in the moments leading up to her death. Slinger walked down the hallway to Lopnow's office and told him about the confusing DNA results. The detectives talked through the timeline they'd made of Nikki's final hours to see if there was maybe some other man in the mix that they could have missed. And that's when they realized something they'd glossed over. On Friday night, when Nikki and her friends went to the second bar, Doug stayed behind at the first bar with one other person, his friend Greg, the designated driver who picked Nikki and Doug up and who was supposed to take them both home. And so Slinger wondered if maybe Greg could have been Doug's co-conspirator. Maybe he was the one who drove Nikki home, and maybe he helped Doug pull off the crime. But that was only speculation. Right now, the sheriff's office didn't have any proof. They did have multiple bloodstains from in and around Doug's house, but they were still waiting for more results from the crime lab to know whose blood it was. And Lopnow said they couldn't keep holding Doug in jail much longer because Doug's DNA was not on Nikki's body. Slinger knew his partner was right. Much to his disappointment, Doug was released from jail on June 10th, almost 3 weeks after Nikki's murder. 10 more weeks would pass with no breakthroughs, and every day, Detective Slinger felt haunted by the knowledge that a killer was right now walking free. Then, in August, 3 months after Nikki's death, the detective got another call from the state crime lab. They'd found a male DNA profile on one of Nikki's socks, and this profile was complete. Slinger submitted the profile to the FBI's National DNA Database, and right away he got a match. Finally, after months of investigation, he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt who the murderer was. Based on the DNA results, along with interviews, cell phone records, and security footage, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Vanderhayden in the early morning hours of Saturday, May 21st, 2016. Just after midnight, the killer strode down the sidewalk in downtown Green Bay, then entered a bar called Richard Cranium's. As soon as he walked in, the killer made eye contact with Nikki, who was sitting on a bar stool across the room. She looked drunk and sad. The killer approached her, sat down, and asked if she wanted to talk. They chatted for a while, and as they did, Nikki's mood began to improve. The killer offered to buy her another drink, but Nikki said no, she'd had more than enough, and she just wanted to go home. so the killer asked if Nikki wanted a ride, and she nodded her head. At about 12:30 a.m., the killer helped Nikki stumble out of Richard Cranium's, then opened the door for her to get into the passenger seat of his car. As they drove away, the killer noticed that Nikki was nodding off. She looked vulnerable, and the killer saw this as an opportunity. Instead of taking Nikki home, the killer drove her to his house. When the car rolled to a stop, Nikki stirred, looked around, and asked what was going on. The killer put a hand on her leg and asked if she wanted to come inside, and she immediately recoiled and said no way. She said she didn't even understand why he would ask that because he knew she had a boyfriend. The killer pulled his hand back and said okay, that was fine, but inside he felt shocked and embarrassed by this rejection. And so as he turned around and began driving towards Nikki's house, inside he was burning up and getting more and more upset, and by the time he got to her house, he decided he was not going to take her no for an answer. He parked outside of Nikki's house and promptly locked all the car doors. Then he reached across the middle console and literally began pulling off Nikki's clothes, and she tried to push him away, but he was a lot bigger than she was. After her clothes were taken off, the killer sexually assaulted Nikki. After the assault was over, Nikki managed to get the door unlocked and jump out of the car. The killer realized that if she got away, she would tell people what had just happened. So the killer jumped out of the driver's seat and grabbed Nikki, and they fought viciously right on the street beside the curb. The killer punched Nikki and tore out chunks of her hair, and Nikki clawed at her killer so hard that her fingernails broke off. Eventually, the killer pushed Nikki down in the street and stomped on her back. As Nikki struggled to get back up, now gravely wounded, the killer ran to his car and grabbed a phone charger. Then he ran back to Nikki, wrapped the cord around Nikki's neck, and strangled her to death. The killer stood upright, breathing heavily. The weight of what he'd just done came crashing down on him, and he looked around, terrified that somebody in the neighborhood had been watching. But the street was dark and quiet. So the killer lifted Nikki's lifeless body into the backseat of his car, and he drove off. As he made his way out of Nikki's neighborhood, the killer noticed a big plot of empty farmland right off of a main road. Without thinking, he pulled over, took Nikki's body out of the back seat, and carried her far enough into the field that nobody would see her from the street. Then, after dumping her in the field, the killer ran back to his car. But just as he was about to get on the highway, he realized he'd forgotten something. Nikki's clothes and purse were still in the car. So, as he was driving, he rolled down the passenger side window and threw the items towards the side of the road before merging onto the freeway. After that, the killer rolled the window back up and tried to steady his breathing. He told himself everything would be okay, nobody would find out what he did. He repeated this to himself over and over until he believed it, and then he just continued on with his life as if nothing had happened. But 3 months later, in August of 2016, the state crime lab finally found the killer's DNA on one of Nikki's socks. Detective Slinger entered the profile into the FBI's national database, and he found a very surprising match. The DNA did not belong to Doug or Doug's friend Greg. In fact, the DNA didn't belong to anybody that Slinger had even heard of. The profile matched a man named George Birch. Police would eventually learn that George was 38 years old, he was 6 foot 7 inches tall, and he had moved to Green Bay from Virginia just 2 months before Nikki's murder. Through national law enforcement records, Detective Slinger discovered that George had a long criminal history, including charges for burglary, possession of a concealed weapon by a felon, drunk driving, and grand larceny. He'd also been investigated by the Green Bay Police Department for potential involvement in a hit-and-run accident in June of 2016. As part of their investigation, the Green Bay Police accessed all of George's cell phone records, including text messages and internet browsing history. Slinger discovered that in the days after Nikki's murder, George Googled her case 64 times. On top of that, GPS data from George's phone gave detectives a map of his movements on the night Nikki was killed. George entered Richard Cranium's bar just after midnight. He left at about 12:30 a.m. and then drove to his house, then Nikki's house, then the field where Nikki's body was found, and finally to the road where her clothes and purse were discovered. The state crime lab eventually found George's DNA all over Nikki's body, on her clothes, and on the phone charger that George used to strangle her. The evidence against Nikki's boyfriend, Doug, did seem strong, especially all that blood, but the lab analysis showed that it was misleading. It turned out the bloody sweatshirt and tissues in Doug and Nikki's bathroom belonged to Nikki's sister, who'd had a nosebleed. The stains in Nikki's car were blood, but the lab determined it came from one of her older kids. And the big dried puddle in the garage, well, it wasn't even human blood. It was actually turkey blood because Doug had gone hunting and killed a turkey. And so, of course, this turn in the case was not what the detectives had expected, but the evidence against George was overwhelming. And so, George was arrested, and Doug was fully exonerated. George Birch was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. George attempted to appeal his conviction in 2021, but it was denied. After Nikki's murder, Doug would raise the baby boy that he had had with Nikki, and Nikki's ex-husband cared for their 2 older children. The Green Bay community also held a fundraiser to collect money for all 3 kids, who now must grow up without their mother. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories, and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support.